Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. Joining me is Simona Mangiante Papadopoulos. She is an attorney, a former EU legal advisor, and the lead interviewer on the new documentary film, Ukraine, the Everlasting Present, which is the third in the trilogy that began with the Oliver Stone-produced film, Ukraine on Fire. This is a bit of the trailer of Ukraine, the Everlasting Present.
How much of the modern Ukraine is controlled by the United States?
Я думаю, що повністю. Мені здається, що Захід не може завершити жодної справи.
You and I have witnessed one of the greatest dramas of the 20th century.
Я никогда не думал, что такое может произойти. Это самое страшное.
Что празднуем?
И всех украинцев с праздником.
Simona, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us about this documentary that you took part in. You went to Ukraine, interviewed key political figures. What are you trying to accomplish with this film that has just been released?
We try to understand actually the history of Ukraine from the declaration of independence for the Soviet Union and make an overall assessment of the results of this independence. Was really independent or this geopolitical strategic position where the West meet the East made of it a sort of client states to leverage Russian influence on the West. This was the key question we dig into in the course of this documentary, which walks the audience through the critical and crucial events that unfortunately resulted in a war today with Russia. I didn't know, obviously, last summer that the outcome would be that tragic, but definitely help people understanding the genesis of this war. And it's not about teaming up with Russia or Ukraine. It's about understanding. Unfortunately, what I noticed in the media, mostly in the mainstream media, is a tendency to simplify the situation, just building up the image of an enemy and completely ignoring the dynamics behind the events that we are assisting to today. Ukraine is a very interesting country, was the most prosperous Soviet republic. Its history is marked by bloody revolutions at sea and heavy involvement of agencies from the West. Now, these are facts and they need and they deserve to be looked into to actually understand better the situation we are living today. I can mention a few of these events, trying to simplify as much as I can an history which is dense of political aspects, interferences from the West and the East as well. I would just to take this a step back into the censorship we are assisting to right now. We know that the same Ukraine on Fire and Revealing Ukraine, which are masterpieces in this trilogy, led by Oliver Stone, have been banned by Amazon. So right now, we know that big tech media trying to shadow all the voices that are out of the core. In reality, I invite everybody to actually have a real perspective, not into siding. It's not a football team. We're not talking about Russia against Ukraine. Everybody, I think, convene about the tragedy of the image we look at into the news. But it's a matter of understanding and not necessarily labeling everyone who tries to understand as a propagandist or worse, a Russian propagandist.
Yeah, and Winter or Ukraine on Fire, which I've seen, it does a great job of that. I mean, I think my only criticism of it is that it sort of downplayed the corruption of Yanukovych, the president who was overthrown. But aside from that, there was a coup in 2014, and that played such a critical role in this war we're seeing now, where the U.S. has been trying to basically use Ukraine as a pawn in its geopolitical ambitions to weaken Russia, instead of acknowledging and letting Ukraine just be neutral and recognizing the fact that Ukraine is a very divided country, that while there are people who loathe Russia and want to be a part of the US-led orbit, there are many people in Ukraine who don't feel that way. And so the answer in that situation is obviously to keep it neutral, not try to push it to one side. And I think a refusal to let Ukraine be neutral is what helps explain why it's now going through this catastrophe. I'm wondering your thoughts on that, the division of Ukraine and the voices of Ukrainians who were not allowed to hear inside the West because they don't go along with this US-led narrative that everybody in Ukraine despises Russia and wants to be a US colony?
Absolutely. Thanks for this very interesting question. Actually, you mentioned the first bloody revolution, which is notorious as Orange Revolution, that saw the pro-Russian pro-Russian president Yanukovych overthrown in favor of President Yushchenko, which you know to be a pro-Western president, very much sympathizing with political leaders in the West. And we can look at pictures of Yushchenko with Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, and many other political leaders. Now, why I make this point, it's precisely to connect with what you say, the interference of the West in Ukraine to trigger those revolutions which are officially presented as people discontent toward having a pro-Russian leader, but in reality saw the massive interference of agencies from the West, including the CIA, and we have witnesses and evidence of these things happening. My opinion is even these facts happened later on 2014 in the Maidan, where another bloody revolution was officially triggered by the people rebelling to the halt in the negotiation between the European Union and Ukraine. Now, do we really believe that such a bloodshed, such a violent protest in the streets can be triggered by the halt in the negotiation between EU and their leader? Of course, there is something highly unlikely. Then we had the opportunity to talk about the identity problems in Ukraine with precisely President Yushchenko, who we know being a nationalist, who we know being a supporter of the people's movement, and under whose presidencies we see the affirmation of Svoboda. I had the chance to make a very interesting question to President Yushchenko, and it's basically why he granted the title of national hero to Roman Shakovich. I should correct my pronunciation. Now, we know Roman Shakovich is somebody known in the Second World War to cooperate with the Nazi Germans. There is a very interesting discussion. I see the table with Yushchenko for at least 5 hours, and he was explaining to me basically how this nationalistic feeling that that endorsed by the Nazi, Ukrainian Nazi de facto, are those who build up the idea of Ukraine as an independent country, using as unifying idea the confrontation with Russia. Nevertheless, we know the cultural roots shared by these two realities are deeper than that, and there are many people who feels the belonging to Russia. Crimea, for example, we know they were a democrat. When we talk about democracy, we know people express their will to belong to Russia. They feel Russians. Everywhere in Ukraine, including other area than the East, more known for being like pro-Russians, having a sentiment of belonging to Russia, they currently speak Russian. We are forcing in some area this sense of identity, which radicates mostly into this people's movement, the Ukrainian Nazi. That's why sometimes I think people in the mainstream media misunderstand what denazification really means. We have to look at the origins of these people movements, origins of Svoboda, and understand that the ones who supported the Nazi in Ukraine were precisely the ones supported by the West, pro-Western leaders like Yushchenko.
Explain for people. So Svoboda, the party you mentioned, that's a far-right party inside of Ukraine, played an integral role in the 2014 Maidan coup. It was founded under a different name, actually, a name that harkens back to the Nazi party, but then changed its name to Svoboda. I think around the and then you mentioned also this Maidan massacre, where just as there was a compromise being brokered, led by the European Union, to essentially end the Maidan protests and keep Yanukovych in power, but curtail his authority and hold new elections very, very quickly. Yanukovych agreed to that power sharing agreement with the opposition. The opposition goes back to the Maidan. They share this with the far right leaders of the Maidan encampment, and the far right says, no way, this guy has to go. And shortly after that, there's a massacre where snipers kill people in the Maidan. It was blamed on Yanukovych's forces. But there's been research done, especially by a Ukrainian scholar at the University of Ottawa named Ivan Kachanovsky, that I think shows conclusively that actually the sniper fire came from the pro-Maidan side. And there's even a leaked recording between top European officials in which they discuss that actually the suspicion is that this was perpetrated by the Maidan coup plotters, not by Yanukovych's forces. And that's why presumably 8 years later, there's been no investigation, no serious investigation done inside Ukraine, no indictments for it. So it seems to me that this was an incident to incite exactly what happened, which is after the power sharing agreement was reached, Yanukovych's forces withdrew as part of that agreement, and the far right took advantage of that and basically threatened violence and forced Yanukovych to flee. And that's when we had a new government installed, which happened to be led by a guy named Yatsenyuk, who we know was the guy chosen by Victoria Nuland in that leaked phone call. So there's a lot we don't know because we haven't, because there's just things like we don't know what we don't know. But on the surface, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this was a coup with US backing.
Absolutely. And precisely in this documentary, we walk people through this, highlight these things that are overshadowed by certain powers. And it's very interesting to hear those facts by the people who deny them. Because, for example, I challenge Yushchenko on this, but of course his narrative was pretty much different. But at the same time, we provide other information from other very controversial individuals, including Andriy Derkash, Deputy Derkash, who had the opportunity to interview, and we know being wanted by the United States for his attempt to expose Maidan affairs in Ukraine. And he also explained to me pretty much in detail the corruption scheme with Burisma and how de facto Ukraine turned into a client state of the United States. If we think that Joe Biden, at the time he was vice president under Obama, had the power to ask the Ukrainian parliament to fire a prosecutor looking into his son dossier. So they are all facts that actually show a big presence of the West and the United States in Ukraine, and also the European Union at the other side. It looks like this land has been weaponized to leverage indeed the Russian influence, but they made a lot of promises to Ukraine that they didn't maintain. So today we have Zelensky, which is using basically this emergency war situation to make reckless requests like joining NATO or accessing to the EU bloc as a response to Russian attacks. But we should know better that this should not be the response, and it's completely reckless to even present the request the way he did.
If somebody from the West, from the US and other NATO states were to say to you, what are we missing about Ukraine? What is not being told to us? What is the most important thing for us to know about the context behind this war in Ukraine that we're not being given? What would you tell them?
Well, I would tell them first and foremost to dig into this nationalism that radicates in these parties and leaders that are welcomed by the West and endorsed by the West, to actually emphasize this problem and trigger and put fire on an issue rather than resolving it. And to understand the history and interference of the West, of our interference in this beautiful, wonderful country, I had the chance to know, and that it's basically triggering a situation where Putin's interests, of course, on the other side have been threatened. And we have to understand that without making any apology or any propaganda, the situation for what it is. So I would like to remind to the people from the West that propaganda is something that we are really very good expert at, starting from the Russia collusion that saw me involved in first place, so I know what I'm talking about in many ways, and also building up the image of Russia and Putin as a demon, to finally simplifying a situation like that with, look, it was the demon we were portraying him to be, look what he's doing, showing a horrible, atrocious image that of course touched the hearts of everybody. But we contributed to cause that. Reality is very different, and we should truly watch the content that is now banned, starting from Ukraine on Fire to this last documentary from Igor Lopatonok. I think it's very instructive, but besides the documentary, really dig into the history of the country without the filter of the mainstream narratives.
your new documentary, it's on YouTube. It also is aired on RT,
Yes, and translated in 7 languages since October.
but
That's
RT is now banned in many countries in Europe, especially.
yeah. So yes, it's banned. So most of the people can't have access to this documentary from the United States or even most of the European countries. So it's uploaded on YouTube. I posted it in my Twitter page, and I invite people first and foremost to watch these masterpieces that precede that, which are Ukraine on Fire and Revealing Ukraine. Really, I think they're really interesting and dense of facts works.
So let me ask you about Russiagate, because you were a central figure in Russiagate. You are the wife of George Papadopoulos, and George Papadopoulos is the former Trump campaign volunteer who, according to the official story, triggered the entire Trump-Russia probe because the FBI in late July 2016 opened up its investigation of the Trump campaign after getting a tip from Australia that Papadopoulos had told someone that Russia might have damaging information on Hillary Clinton that it could use to help the Trump campaign. Now, we learned way later on that the tip that the FBI got was incredibly vague, that what it said about George Papadopoulos, your husband, is that he had suggested some kind of suggestion of Russian help. It was very, very vague, and no mention of the stolen emails that are at the heart of Russiagate. So I don't buy the FBI's official story that they opened up the investigation based on your husband, George Papadopoulos's apparent comments. But regardless, that's what happened. And you, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you introduced George to Joseph Mifsud, who is okay.
No, sorry, I correct you right now.
All right,
We happen to work.
Let me just explain who Joseph Mifsud is, and then you can correct me. Joseph Mifsud is apparently this person who George Papadopoulos met in the spring of 2016, and apparently told George about some kind of Russian help for the Trump campaign. And so I have read that it was you who introduced George to him, but that's false.
Well, I didn't introduce Mifsud to George. I knew Mifsud for much longer than George. While I was working at the European Parliament, he was an activist in the socialist group. Actually, George and I happened to work for the same company, the London Centre of International Law Practice, where Mifsud was a director. So we met him independently from each other. So I didn't introduce Mifsud to George. I just happened to know Mifsud and his connection much before him. So that's in this context that I testified 3 times to the FBI, the Congress, and the Senate of the United States, sharing the information I had about Mifsud. Now, of course, all the situation with the Russiagate, it's fake. If it was triggered by my husband talking with Joseph Mifsud about dirt on Hillary Clinton that he supposedly would have transmitted to any other person in the campaign, which he didn't, and he denied doing. Where is Joseph Mifsud now? We know this person disappeared from hurt. We don't know him dead or alive, which is, of course, a very suspicious fact. One of the things I testified, I can share with you, is that Joseph Mifsud was an active socialist. He was campaigning for Hillary Clinton in 2016 in Philadelphia. This, of course, makes it highly unlikely that he would set up a member of the team, Trump team, to help Trump to win the election, offering some sort of dirt. Of course, it was in the best scenario was a setup, but in the worst, we don't know. Definitely was not somebody working with the Kremlin to help Trump win the election. This is something that has been completely debunked, and it's out of any reasonable ground now that we look at the facts from far.
Yes. As for him campaigning in Philadelphia, I've never heard that, so I can't vouch for that. But what I can say is that Mifsud, after George Papadopoulos told the FBI about him, because the FBI didn't even know about Mifsud apparently until George Papadopoulos.
No, exactly.
Yeah. After that, Mifsud came to the US in early 2017, and the FBI interviewed him. According to the record of that interview released by the FBI, they barely asked him any questions and they let him go. And Mueller later said in his report that Mifsud had lied to the FBI, but yet they never indicted him for lying. While meanwhile, they indicted many other people for allegedly lying. So it's so odd what is going on there, and we can only speculate. But the fact is, if Mifsud is really some Russian agent who told George Papadopoulos that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton, the FBI has certainly never treated him that way because they interviewed him, didn't arrest him, and haven't indicted him since.
Exactly.
So it's very curious, and there's all kinds of speculation. I mean, there's speculation that he really is some kind of Western intelligence asset. And again, I've seen no evidence for that. So it's all, but do you have any suspicion as to who he actually is, and then why he's been missing in action for the last 6 years now, or 5 years? He's gone completely dark.
Well, definitely somebody can disappear as a physical person in this world, dead or alive. We lost completely track. This person must have a job, is estranged now from his family. It seems like nobody can track his presence on Earth, which is, of course, highly suspicious. I know for sure that Joseph Mifsud was close to intelligence circles. He was a professor at the Link campus in Rome, which is known to train intelligence people in Italy. And we know that they are the one who provided to Mifsud living and a place where to live in Umbria, a region in Italy. 2 years later, this entire situation was exposed. So that's the last known address of Joseph Mifsud. It's Umbria, in a place paid by the Link campus, or hosted by a professor of the Link campus. We know the Link campus being directed by Vincenzo Scotti, who was also minister in Italy, which was managing the Italian secret services. So there are many things that make me believe that it was some sort of a Western intelligence asset, though I can't, of course, prove it. That's my understanding, judging from the circles he used to be close to. And that's why I think it's very important. It's actually precisely after I gave my testimony about Joseph Mifsud's connection that this sort of smearing campaign about my persona started to take place, saying that I'm not Italian but Russian, that I'm a Russian agent, etc., etc. All, of course, has been cleared up and never been even formally accused of anything, just from the perception point of view, trying to build up an image. What I think today, when I look at the Russia delusion and the way we are presenting this war in Ukraine, is that the image of the Russia of an enemy is the result of something that worked to build up the image of it as an enemy. And how much propaganda, how much is not true. It's important to have a clean and transparent information. And it's important to have, like podcasts like yours, where we can freely discuss about these topics and probably add information to the ones already accessed by most.
I'm still putting the pieces together, but there is a huge connection between Russiagate and the war in Ukraine today. But before I get into that, let me just ask you quickly. So you were interviewed by the FBI and by Congress back when they were doing their Russia investigations. Have you or George Papadopoulos been interviewed at all by Special Counsel John Durham, who was looking now into the origins of Russiagate and the intelligence misconduct that took place?
No, none of us. I believe the records of my interviews, and also George testified once to Congress, are available to John Durham, and I know he already came to Italy for his own due diligence. So definitely he had access to those testimony, but not yet interviewed by him.
Yeah. Well, okay. So then just connecting Russiagate to now this war in Ukraine. So many of the key players in Russiagate have a major role now. And first of all, there was this overlooked interference by Ukrainians in the 2016 election when they leaked claims about Paul Manafort to get him fired. And they leaked this so-called black ledger of these secret payments that he was getting, which appear to be frauds. And Ukrainian officials openly admitted, this was in the Financial Times, that they were interfering in the election because they were worried about Trump, because Trump at the time was criticizing NATO and was talking about cooperating with Russia. And Ukrainians who were put in power by the US in the 2014 coup saw this as a threat to them. So they actually, for all the hoopla about Russian interference in the election, it was documented that Ukrainians actually did interfere, and they resulted in getting Paul Manafort fired and fueling innuendo about Trump being beholden to the Kremlin. And also that summer, there was a controversy that arose when at the Republican National Convention, there was some proposed platform language in the RNC platform where that was calling for arming Ukraine in its fight against Russia. And some language that called for, that was more hawkish was rejected. The final platform, which by the way is meaningless, these platforms don't even matter. But anyway, the final platform still called for arming Ukraine and was actually far more militarist than the Democratic Party platform was that same summer. But somehow this was turned into a controversy that the Trump campaign had intervened to water down the platform in order to please Russia. And then Christopher Steele in his dossier, he wrote that this was part of the quid pro quo between Trump and Russia, that Trump was going to stop making Ukraine a campaign issue in exchange for Russian help. And meanwhile, Christopher Steele is very tight with Victoria Nuland, who was the official who helped back the coup in 2014, is now a top official running Biden's policy today. And Christopher Steele was sending Victoria Nuland reports about Ukraine. And even before, and gets back to your husband's involvement, even before the FBI opened up the Trump-Russia investigation, Christopher Steele sent Victoria Nuland parts of his dossier. And she said this has to go to the FBI. And Victoria Nuland also signed off on an FBI agent who was based in Rome named Mike Gaeta. And I wrote about this recently, and I'll link to this in my segment. She authorized him to go meet with Christopher Steele in early July 2016. And this is weeks before the FBI officially opened up its Trump-Russia probe. So there's a lot of just strange connections there. And just this overall climate, as you're talking about, of demonizing Russia, painting Russia as this enemy, which has the ability to brainwash millions of Americans via social media memes and hacked emails, and calling alleged Russian hacking the equivalent of 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, as so many top Democratic politicians and pundits have done. All of this, I really do believe, as you say, has set the stage for now. We're in this hot war where diplomacy with Russia is just off the table. And there's this the strong current to encourage even more war and using Ukraine as cannon fodder for all that.
Absolutely. And if any collusion ever happened, as you mentioned, is Ukrainian collusion who tried to interfere in the US election. We know that even Poroshenko on the record said that Ukrainian had all interest for Hillary Clinton to become president rather than Trump at the time of the election, 2016 election. We know these people are masters in projections, and so we have now access to a certain number of elements, fact and evidence to make our own assessment.
Let me ask you also something I forgot to mention before, which is the war in the Donbas that's been going on for 8 years. And people right now are rightly horrified at the civilian toll of Russia's assault on Ukraine, the refugees, civilians being killed, all sorts of awful allegations against Russia. But what people don't understand is that this war actually has been going on, or a war in Ukraine has been going on for 8 years. And that is when the people in the Donbas, rebels in the Donbas, took up arms against the US-backed coup government that was waging an assault on essentially Russian heritage inside of Ukraine, banning the Russian language, and having a government that was dominated in key cabinet positions by the far right and even some neo-Nazis. So in the course of your research inside Ukraine, what did you learn about the war in the Donbas? 14,000 people killed, the majority of them on the rebel-held side, and the overlooked reality of what life has been like for people living under this assault.
Well, definitely, we have access to information that all these conflicts are caused by the neo-Nazi and have been weaponized by Zelensky to justify Russian attacks at the border. We have different type of information coming from investigative journalists like George Papadopoulos that I would like to mention in this podcast, because he's in Donbas and he does real information over there, which shows a completely different reality. But most importantly, we know this conflict is going on for 8 years, but our empathy comes just now. reality is again very different from what it's portrayed to be, and this region has been under constant threat of the Ukrainian Nazi, when we're talking about the nationalist movements, and that they are being exploited to justify and to stage a conflict attributed to Russia in first place. So it's a very different type of information. This investigative journalist there that is actually reporting from the region, and it's very interesting. It's worth a follow. But let's talk about, again, this world and West concern for protecting democracy without really understanding what's going on. I mean, I'm stunned how Americans already forgot what's happening in Afghanistan. We reckless withdrew troops from Joe Biden without a real plan, exposing again the Taliban to take over with terrible, catastrophic things happening right now there. I already forgot. That's how people are. They already forget. They embrace a cause, and obviously it's always about Russia. But you know, it's pretty poor as assessment of our outlook on facts.
So Simona, any final words for us as we wrap?
Well, I would like to thank you for this very interesting conversation. I see you're very much. You know very well what's going on, and it's very enriching to talk to somebody who's actually has an understanding of the history of Ukraine and the different interests playing there. And I would really invite people to not buy into football teams, not thinking with their feelings. There are many places in the world where democracy at stakes. This is not a war for democracy. This is not Putin imperialistic whims coming up from nowhere and invading Ukraine. Is not crazy, as I read in a few articles here in Europe. There are many reasons to this conflict that we need to understand, and to understand also our own responsibilities and how to, you know, guarantee peace. Peace comes from truth, not from inflaming propaganda wars. And I understand that in time of crisis, it's always convenient to build the image of an enemy, but you know, at some point we should ask ourselves this question: is really Russia and Russia only? Just, you know, dig into that.
By the way, one thing I forgot to mention, because there's so much just to go over, just to underscore what a central role Russiagate has played in this current conflict of today. Right after Russiagate failed, when Robert Mueller gave his testimony in late July 2019, and it was late July 2019, yeah, and it was such a disaster. Democrats immediately pivoted to Ukrainegate, where they impeached Trump after he paused some weapon sales to Ukraine. And of course, the allegation was that he was doing that to pressure Ukraine to spread some dirt about Joe Biden. But a major part of that impeachment trial was Democrats embracing this view that we needed to, in Adam Schiff's words, use Ukraine to, quote, fight Russia over there. And Trump, by briefly impeding that by pausing some weapon sales, was deemed to be this national disaster and a grave threat to the country. So it speaks to how important the Ukraine proxy war has been to the bipartisan foreign policy establishment. And now we're seeing the consequence of that by using Ukraine to fight Russia over there, in Adam Schiff's words. Now Russia is fighting back to end the fight in a really disastrous and catastrophic way. And that's why it's so important to have dissenting voices like yours who can give people an alternative perspective on how all this has come to be.
Thank you. It's truly really true. We are using this any sort of excuse as a pretext, and now we are fighting Russia over there after we build up Russia as the enemy of humanity. And we forgot that the biggest loss of everything is the permanent loss at this point of true peaceful cooperation with Russia, which is still a very gave a lot to the humankind in terms of technology, science, and a lot of things we should have built on rather than antagonize.
Especially since they have nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Which makes this all the more reckless to continue to fuel. Simona Mangiante Papadopoulos, former legal advisor to the European Union, attorney, and lead interviewer for the new documentary film, which hopefully people can still find if it hasn't been censored by the time this goes out, and we'll link to it. It's called Ukraine, the Everlasting Present. Simona, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.